We'd been following prints for 3 days before the forest opened and stole my breath. The first morning, Vince swore it was a bear track. Broad, deep, the kind that makes a seasoned tracker pause. By the second day, the prints had stretched into something else altogether. A stride that suggested height and a weight distributed in a way a bear's never manages. On the third afternoon, as the pines thinned, and a wet, moss-sweet light spilled down into a low basin, the ground told the truth. A single impression lay in the muck beside a fallen cedar. 17 inches from heel to toe, 7 inches across the ball, 5 rounded toe pads in a slightly splayed arc. The pattern carried delicate ridge-like lines across the sole, faint dermal ridges that looked like fingerprints run along bark and mud. Someone had packed the print and set it carefully, a man-made path for whoever had made it to step back into hiding. I remember bending, the sun warm on my neck although the shade kept the valley cool. Vince took a picture with his Nikon. The clack and whir of the camera seemed too loud in that hush. He's always been a photographer first, a vet second. Vietnam taught him how to see light through a scope and how to keep steady when everything around you shakes. He said nothing. He just knelt and ran his gloved finger along the outer rim of the print, then traced the 5 toes as if checking whether they belonged to a thing or a person. We had come because of my grandfather's notebooks. Old Man Reed had been a trapper and a talker, sometimes both in the same breath, and his journals were more map of mood than guide. But he had a page, tucked between faded receipts, where he'd sketched a footprint that didn't match anything he'd seen. "Not a man," he wrote in his looping hand, "not any beast I know. Leaves like hands." That line was the flashlight that put us on the trail. I wanted a story to put in a magazine. Vince wanted a reason to get away from the town and the names he couldn't trip over for 5 minutes. We were boys with different kinds of debts. We pushed down into the basin. The Bronco scraped rock and sagged on the ruts, so we left it and walked the last mile. The valley smelled like old growth and the tang of rain waiting somewhere upriver. Wind threaded through cedar tips and brought with it a low, resonant hum, too organized to be wind alone. The sound sat under everything like an undertone, not a song, not yet, but the sense that the place listened as much as it was lit. Then the structures appeared. They were built between standing trunks and knuckled roots, stretched with woven branches and barkskins taut like drums. At first glance you could have said they were human shelters, lean-tos and wigwams of a kind you'd expect in a survival manual. But they had features that no human camp of the region used. Walls braided from thin saplings were held in place by carved bone toggles. Door frames were broad enough to admit a tall shoulder. Some openings were low, suggesting the builders sat or crouched when they entered. Platforms of interlaced willow acted like porches. A few roofs were thatched with grass, but others were layered with a scaly, dark mat that smelled faintly of tar and something warmer, an animal oil perhaps, used to weather the rain. There were also signs of prior human contact. A length of wire, rusted and knotted into a makeshift hinge, tied a tarp to a branch. A strip of cloth, faded to a dun color, fluttered like a flag on a pole. In the openings of one shelter, something bright and folded lay like a relic, a square of paper browned at the edges. Vince was the one who picked it up. He turned it around in his hands, eyes narrowing. It was a page torn from a newspaper, typeface of the sort used in the 1970s, though the headline was partial and flaked away. He said the paper was important, and we'd keep it, and that was how he made decisions sometimes, by naming a thing defensible. We moved slowly, the way men do when they are not sure whether they are intruders or invited. Every stick that cracked underfoot sounded like a shot. At the center of the clearing, a circle of stones held ashes as if a fire had only recently cooled. A few small bones lay stacked like tools. A woven basket, still damp with sap, leaned against a trunk. Patterned scratches on the bark beside it looked deliberate. Sequences of short marks, then a spiral, then another line. An alphabet of the place. When we rounded a last stand of cedars, we met them. They had seen us before we saw them. 2 figures rose out of shadow at the edge of the clearing, massive, shaped by muscles under a coat of coarse, dark hair. They did not come toward us exactly. They moved into the light like creatures curious about a noise at the edge of their home. One was taller, stooped in a way that suggested age, shoulders bowed, but steady. I would later come to think of this one as Cora. The other was leaner and more abrupt in movement, hands that we could not mistake for anything but hands, fingers long and careful. 3. The first look was all animal and human smashed into one frame, faces broad, noses flattened into the plane of the face, eyes set deep and reflecting the bright afternoon. But their eyes were not wild. There was a tempered calm there, the kind of watchfulness that grows in beings who measure risk as a ritual. Vince made the mistake of reaching for the rifle slung across his back. The sound of leather shifted like a warning. Cora lifted a hand in a slow, open gesture, palm out, fingers extended. It's an old display of non-aggression, something we learned in the Marines and something any hunter might use when offered a closer look. Vince hesitated mid-motion, then lowered the strap. I stepped in front of him like a bad brother, because perhaps he needed someone who would look less like a veteran and more like a child with his hands empty. I said, "Easy," and my voice came out thin and strange, the sort of sound that betrays every practiced calm. I set the camera down, palms out to show nothing but skin. Cora's hand was larger than mine. The skin on the back of the hand looked like a worn glove. When he moved, the fingers came close enough to cast shadow across my knuckles. He made a low vocalization, a rolling, throat-sounded note that felt like a language built of breath. It could have gone wrong in half a second. They could have fled, or screamed, or turned aggressive, or the boys in us could have laughed and made a rash joke. Instead, something fragile happened. We traded a look across an impossible gulf, and then, as if answering a private question, Cora reached out and pressed a palm to my cheek. It was not a touch of teeth or claws. It was soft, patient, and astonishing in its intimacy. The skin on my face prickled with cold sweat. For a second the world contracted, and there was only the thrum of my pulse and the faint smell of the valley on Cora's breath, earth and a deep green mineral tang. Then 3 came forward and set down a bowl. It was carved out of a hollowed log and filled with what looked like dried roots and thin strips of meat. He pushed it toward us and tapped his chest with the flat of his hand, my name in a way, understood by emotion instead of speech. Vince crouched, palms open, and accepted the offering the way you accept a truce. Communication at first was a study in gestures. We had no shared words. Vince, being Vince, opened his notebook and drew a crude rectangular campfire, then a stick figure, then a round face with eyes. Cora watched the shapes, and then drew back on a strip of bark with a blunt implement. His lines were quick, sure. Where my sketches tended toward simplification, his were dense with texture. A face showing more planes than a human portrait, a hand larger and its fingers spread on a tree, a shape that could be a boat or a back. There were items that spoke for themselves. A metal blade, pitted and stamped with a maker's mark I'd learned to recognize in old tool catalogs, lay under a woven flap. I wiped it with the hem of my shirt. The date stamped into the handle came out faint but legible, early 1900s. A scrap of binding revealed the corner of a book printed in the 19th century. 3 rolled a drawing out for us, and it was a map of sorts, lines and dots that marked places I could not yet name, and a small icon repeated across the paper. A rotor-shaped symmetrical thing we would only later identify as a helicopter. We stayed where we were that first day until twilight bled the valley into a single shadow. Cora and 3 did not try to move us back to the vehicle or to a place outside their clearing. Instead, they guided us to a larger structure at the far edge, a hollowed trunk lined with woven mats. Inside it smelled of smoke, moss, and a faint metallic tang. On one wall hung a gallery of drawings, fastened with bone pins. Each image was a scene, people upright and hunched, hands passing objects, a figure that might be a portrait. In the center of one panel was a depiction of something with blades above it and ropes descending like teeth. An image of capture. If my instinct, and the little of their sign language we could coax out had anything to do with it. We slept there that first night with the fire between us, and for the first time in my life, I heard a voice in my sleep that was not human. It was not a word, but a motif, a series of notes. 3 hummed softly, like a wind pulling in a sequence. Cora answered with a low throat sound, and the pattern wound into our dream like a key. I woke at dawn, with my face imprinted with the memory of that touch. If you love true-to-life wilderness mysteries, stay with us. We stayed because our curiosity had teeth sharper than caution. We told ourselves it was for documentation, evidence for a magazine, for science, for the notebooks that had led me here. But by the second day, we understood we'd been seduced into a different role. The things we found were not merely specimens to be catalogued. They were people in an unfamiliar register, creatures who used tools, built shelters with architectural logic, kept organized stores, and preserved their history. The second block of discoveries came faster than we could record. Inside a woven chest we found paper bundles wrapped in oilcloth. The outermost package held a torn copy of a naturalist's summary, North American Wildlife 1889, its spine broken, and pages mottled with age. The margin notes were in a hand that did not look like anyone we knew. Small, angled runic marks worked into the printed text, as if someone had annotated it in a different breath. Several pages contained pressed specimens, leaves, fragments of dried herb, laid with deliberate spacing, like entries in a field manual. 3 led us sometimes to small storehouses under cedar roots where trophies of memory were kept. There was a portrait carved on bark of a figure with the same broad face as Kura, but shown carrying a child across the back, arms folded in a way that read like protection. Charcoal sketches depicted what we later realized were names and positions in their group. Marks in a corner meant leader. A different spiral meant healer. Kura would point to certain faces in the gallery and produce a single low note. His expression tightened. He tapped the charcoal portrait and then moved his hand in a slow, rhythmic scraping motion, the sort of gesture that meant absence. The first time he did that, I felt the weight of grief settle like dew. In the margins of the largest panel, layered one image upon another, there was a sequence that arrested me. At the bottom, a row of figures stood in a line with small nets above them drawn like clouds. Above that, in later scratches, someone had etched a machine with blades suspended in the air, and below it, a line of small boxes and hooked shapes. The style shifted across the panels. Older images were crude, younger ones precise and almost mechanical in their detailing. Someone had tried to draw metal. Someone had tried to show the sound of rotors. We made measurements where we could. I kept a field journal because habits hold you to reality. The prints we'd followed averaged 17 inches long and 7 inches wide. Some showed 5 toes splayed with the pressure marks at the tips like fingertips on clay. The shelter's openings ranged from 2.5 to 3.5 feet in height. The rafters were lashed 12 to 16 inches apart. Tools were fashioned from bone, antler, and on 2 occasions, metal. One knife bore the stamped mark of an early 20th century manufacturer. The tang had been broken long ago and rewrapped with plant fiber. The presence of that blade meant contact. Someone at some point had offered or traded metal, or it had been salvaged from a wreck. It hinted at the in-between spaces the valley occupied, neither wholly cut off nor fully integrated with the outside world. We learned small things from them. 3 was an artist in the literal sense. He would scratch a line and then add color from mashed berries or earth pigments, and the resulting images had movement. He showed us how to weave bark into a stronger cord and how to stitch a seam using a bone awl. He demonstrated the use of a simple trap to catch fish from a river eddy. Nothing cruel, more like a channeling of water than a cage. Kura, older and more deliberate, taught a sense of watchfulness. He had rituals for when the rotors were loud, a sequence of sounds he made to test the valley's response. He taught us to listen for the specific cadence of distant engines and to count their beats. It was not all domestic. There were things in the outskirts of the camp that sharpened the edges of our instincts. Outside a ring of thorned brush, we found an army surplus container, the kind with a welded lid and a painted serial number worn almost smooth. Within it lay a handful of bullet casings, spent, oxidized, their head stamps obscured by time and rust. Near the container, small anchors and lengths of nylon cord had been frayed and knotted into traps. The evidence suggested at least a history of attempts at capture, something that had not been gentle. I want to be careful here about words like government and military, because inside the valley, without documents with letterhead or credentials, those terms are guesses. What we had were artifacts and patterns, helicopters circling high and low over the years, nets and traps of a kind designed to corral rather than kill. A ragged scrap of paper with a reward notice printed in a typeface commonly used by private firms offering bounties for specimens. The thread suggested an outside interest that was neither purely commercial nor purely scientific. It had the tense smell of someone looking to own what they did not yet understand. We sat with that knowledge and tried to make a decision with fewer illusions. The idea that someone, some entity, would want to take these beings claimed us slowly. When we found a photo, half melted in a fire pit but recognizable as a man in an olive jacket standing beside a downed rotorcraft, Vince swore. He'd seen choppers in the sky back in the war that moved with a particular predatory rhythm. To him, the pictures and casings and nets formed a pattern that made a terrible kind of sense. That whatever these valley dwellers were, they were valuable enough to hunt. We were not hunters. We were outsiders, inclined and guilty and yet not without conscience. We owed the valley two things simultaneously: the documentation that would prove beyond the whisper of rumor that something unique existed here, and the privacy to allow that uniqueness to survive. That tension sat on top of our shoulders like a wet sack. On the fourth day, Kura took us deeper. He led us up a slope to a shallow cave cut into basalt. Its mouth was the size of a barn door and almost obscured by hanging ferns. Inside, the air was cooler, and the light narrowed into shafts where dust motes moved like slow constellations. The walls were not smooth. They were a palimpsest of charcoal and scraped mineral, a layered archive. By their ordering and density, you could see a timeline. Lower panels contained stick people in formations, hunting, gathering, making. Mid-wall images depicted exchanges, hands handing over small glowing objects, figures carrying elongated sacks, someone being led with rope at the hands. The upper panels were the ones that made us both hold our breath. Organized machines drawn with disturbing precision, rotors sketched as concentric circles with strokes that suggested force and noise. Children, small figures, drawn under a net-like web, a sequence showing figures being raised into the air on slings, then set down again in frames that suggested translation, movement of people from one place to another. One panel was layered over another, as if someone had tried to erase the past and then been unable or unwilling to fully hide it. In that layering, we read a memory too raw to be covered. At the base, original pigment was smoky and thick, hands linked, a line of figures marching with offerings. Over it, recent charcoal had been rubbed in a hurried way to show a rotor, a dangling item, and a net that fell like teeth. The youngest scratches carried a notation unknown to me then, a tally of I's and X's that three traced with a bone implement, and which he tapped with a sorrowful rhythm. When I pressed my palm to the wall, the charcoal smudged on my skin. Kura watched me. He touched the wall with his knuckle, then ran his hand along a sequence of marks and made the scraping gesture of absence again. It felt like seeing a record of injury made by a community who, like every other, tried to keep a ledger. There was a corroded tin can lodged in a fissure. Inside it, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a folded piece of paper browned to a fragile translucence. Vince unfolded it with care. The headline was almost illegible, but we could pick out fragments. A partial date in the late 1960s, a phrase about capture and research, and a typewritten line that suggested the interest was lucrative enough for someone to risk the mountains. Whoever had put it in that can wanted it preserved, hidden, and perhaps remembered. The cave felt like a courtroom. You could stand in it and listen, if you could decode the images, for a litany of offenses, overflights, nets, men with tranquilizer gear, the taking of young. Kura pressed his hand to the largest drawing of the rotor, and then put both hands to his chest. His voice, when he made it, was a low note that rose and fell in a cadence that suggested naming names. It was the most human thing I'd heard him do. Vocabulary in the key of grief. We left the cave with our notebooks heavy. The valley seemed smaller under the weight of that knowledge and, paradoxically, more fragile. The decision to keep silent about the place became, in moments, a moral argument we rehearsed and refined and then softened with excuses. If we told the right authority, could we secure protection? If we told no one, could we be guardians? Each angle had its own ironies and dangerous loopholes. The world beyond the trees promised intervention in the form of law and reason and men in uniforms who would, in their way, solve mysteries by turning them into possessions. That night, sitting under a sky that ached with stars, I thought about my grandfather's handwriting. He had been a man of simple rules. Leave the wild the wild. He had written once, "Some things belong to the dark because the dark belongs to them." I had idolized the edge of his thought as a boy. It had guided my feet into a clearing that erased my assumptions. Vince and I argued in low voices that night. He wanted to photograph everything and leave with stacks of film and proofs. He wanted to make the world know there were beings with culture and memory who had been surviving. He feared that secrecy would only postpone violence. I feared that telling the world would invite the worst kinds of people, men who equated the unknown with opportunity. When the argument dissolved into exhaustion, we ate the dried meat that 3 offered, and listened to the valley breathe around us. Kura and 3 hummed, their voices low enough to be felt in your chest. For a handful of hours, the world was balanced on a knife edge between revelation and protection. It is a remarkable sensation to feel that balance, and know you must decide where to let the blade fall. On the 5th morning, before we could fully promise one path or the other, a distant thump started in the air, regular and mechanical. At first I thought it was the bass of a far-off storm, but the cadence was too distinct. Kura froze, head cocked. His hand went to the side of his face where the hair thinned, and he closed his eyes. He began to emit a soft, layered note I had heard in the night song, only now it was stretched out and sharp, like a warning. Vince looked up. He had the camera. We both expected the sky to be clear. The sound grew, a low, grinding thud that moved from the east and became a presence. Then, through the trees, we saw it. A dark silhouette against the afternoon sky. A machine that did not belong to birds. It passed over the valley once, twice, low enough that the treetops trembled. For a moment, it was just a shape. Then it lowered, slow and deliberate, the blade stirring a smell of engine oil that made the mouths of the valley creatures purse. Kura barked something, a short urgency that we were just barely able to parse as instruction. He gathered a length of cord from a post and moved with a speed that contradicted his stooped frame. 3 snatched up a small carved object from the gallery, pressed it into Vince's hand, and then took his own stance between the shelter and the machine's landing. Their movements were not panic so much as practiced maneuvers, an established protocol for what to do when the rotor came close. Hide, protect, mark memory. The machine descended and crossed the sky in a way that suggested a search pattern. It banked, its shadow sweeping across the clearing like a hand. Down below, men in jackets the color of old raincoats peered out at the trees and the patches of bare ground, their shapes inside the machine only glimpsed through the slanted windows. We crouched and held our breaths while the engine's low lament filled the valley. The machine skirted the far ridge and then passed beyond the sink, as if the pilot had decided the clearing was not worth the trouble. Or perhaps they'd observed a sign that told them this particular valley was guarded and left for now. Either way, the image of that rotor burned a hole in us that no explanation erased. We had come to the valley to find a story. Instead, we had arrived inside one. The discovery of the cave with the rotor's images, the paper with its reward notice, the casings in the surplus container, the blade with the stamped date, shifted the whole thing from mystery into moral conundrum. Someone was looking. Someone had been looking for years. The valley was not an island but a target. In the hours after the flyover, Kura sat with us and circled his hand in the same gesture he used at the cave, score-marking with his thumb until his knuckles were white. He tapped the ground, then his own chest. 3 produced a little tablet of bark and carved with astonishing speed a symbol I came to learn meant others. He set it between us like a plea. Vince and I exchanged a look that tasted of iron. There would be choices now that would matter for more than a magazine byline. To tell the world might save them from ignorance but expose them to capture. To stay and protect meant forfeiting the hope of formal legal protection and binding ourselves to secrecy and the constant threat of being discovered and punished. We slept poorly that night, not from the fear of the machine but from the knowledge of what its return could mean. Dawn came with the sound of a river and the distant cleave of a crow. Kura and 3 moved with a slow diligence about the camp, their hands busy in the same way any household is busy, repairing, tending, reminding. But the rhythm had changed. There was an undercurrent of preparation. They dug shallow caches where gear and some of the things they loved could be hidden. They sharpened both wooden spears and their own instincts. They made a kind of list by motion. Items to save, paths to clear. We made our list too, in our own way. Papers into the Bronco, photographs hidden in a film canister taped inside the seat, a backup battery that Vince swore he had willfully sterilized of modern tech in case anyone traced radio waves. It was ridiculous, our notion of security, but it felt like something we could do to honor the choice we were making. Not long after, we realized our presence itself might be an asset. Kura and 3 were curious about the broader world, but not naive. They had, from what we could gather, a cultural memory of being taken, of roving men and machines that did not understand. We could translate on a limited level. We could testify if needed. We could be witnesses the way a court allows, if the world accepted that testimony. That thought warmed the problem for a moment and then left it colder than before. Who would believe us? Who would care? And perhaps more damningly, who would come? Not to help, but to profit. We developed a quiet plan that looked more like a habit than a strategy. Document without dramatizing, help where help was asked for, learn the rhythms of patrols and hide when necessary, teach the valley how to interpret the outside noises, and decide who and what might befriend. I kept writing in my journal because habit keeps you honest. Vince kept photographing, because making images felt like the best way to prove what our eyes had seen without offering our testimonies to rumor and greed. The valley accepted us with a wary, open-handed hospitality that seemed both natural and intentional. We taught them how to load film and to hold a shutter. They taught us songs whose melodies crawled like roots around an ember. They showed us ways to read the weather from the alignment of moss on stone, and we showed them how our world recorded stories on metal and paper. In time, 3 drew our faces in charcoal, then added us to their gallery, sketching hands that reached for one another, as if to define kinship. And yet, the rotors were a fact that hung in the air like a scent. We heard them again and again, sometimes high and distant, sometimes low enough to ruffle hair. Once they passed so low, the Bronco's hood hummed in a key that made us all look up. Once, in the early spring, when snow still clung to the north side of the rocks, a rotor caught in a thermal, and the pilot did a lazy circle before moving on. Each time, we responded with the practiced rituals Kura taught us: hide, wait, count, and each time the valley held its breath. On a wet morning when fog draped the trees like a veil, Kura led us to a stone outcropping near the mouth of the river. There, tucked into a cleft, was the remains of a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in the skin of a small mammal, lay a handful of blackened paper and a pocket watch that had stopped at some indifferent hour. The cardboard had brittle print across it, advertisements for bounties, a typed note that spoke of specimens for study, and a photograph. A group of men with light jackets, smiles held like instruments, posed with an animal propped between them. The animal's eyes were closed, fur matted, its posture slack with the wrongness of being posed. Kura tapped the photo and then tapped his chest, then brought his hand across his face in a long, sorrowful sweep. The motion was a story. We understood it without words. There had been taking before. The box was a ledger entry in a tragedy that had not ended. We came to see patterns in the traces. Nets, spare coils of rope fashioned for hauling, not for killing. Bullet casings, the head stamps worn away by rain and time. A smudge on a rock that, under examination, looked like a chemical residue consistent with sedatives used in veterinary practice. The valley's archives, the cave, the journals woven into bark, the charcoal portraits, spoke of raids, not random collisions with curiosity. They spoke of organized interest. That organization, I learned in the months that followed, is what made the danger terrifying. It suggested an apparatus of returners, men and machines that would come back, refine their methods, and escalate until the community could no longer hide. We had, unwittingly, stepped into a running story. We were the only 2 outside witnesses, living in the shadows of a place that had been, for generations, its own world. I say we, and think often of how arrogant that pronoun is. We were two humans in a valley of a culture formed of different hands, living in a legal gray where good intentions could become entrapment. By the end of my first month, our routine had the measured cadence of ritual. Mornings were for repair and reconnaissance, checking the perimeters, noting any new tire tracks in the mud, listening to the AM radio Vince had rigged into the Bronco for local broadcasts. Evenings were for language and song. The music of the valley seeped into my mind until I could hum the cadence. Sometimes, in the quiet before sleep, I would sit and listen to Kura sing the names of people I had never met. His voice rolled like a river stony with names. I began to keep a different notebook, an index of artifacts, a ledger of encounters. I drew the cave art and annotated it. I photographed the prints with a tape measure beside them and wrote down exact measurements. 17 inches, 7 inches, 5 toes, repeatable, insistent facts. I noted the nature of the shelters, braided rafters, bark roofs, dimensions of entryways. These were the kinds of details a skeptical archivist could use to argue, if needed, that what we were seeing had pattern and history and more than animal instinct. The valley gave as much as it guarded. 3 showed us how to repair a skin with a sinew stitch that held against freezing rain. He taught us a symbol language that worked across hands and faces. 2 quick taps meant a path was safe. A slow drag of the thumb across the lip meant silence. At night, small fires flared and stories were told without the linearity of a human tale. They were more like tapestries. You touched one thread and learned a family history. Yet the evidence of pursuit did not relent. A fresh casing appeared near a ridge one week where we had not been before. Someone, either accident or intention, had cut a mark into a tree at the edge of the valley, a sign that indicated a path. We found a net, recently mended, hidden in a thicket, its weave crude but effective. The valley's survivors moved with the knowledge that history repeats. Every mark was a memory and a lesson. I can still recall a day when I stood at the edge of the clearing and listened to a human radio show about conservationists arguing in a city far away about the ethics of specimen collection. Their voices came tinny and performative out of a small transistor hidden in Vince's pack. Here in the valley, the conversation translated into a different language of fact. The idea of collection had teeth. To take for study was, in practice, to possess. Possession had always been the hunger of men who saw novelty as utility rather than otherness. We moved, therefore, like people who had been taught how to be thieves of attention. We took what we could in silence. A drawing here, measurements there, a photograph when the light fell just right. We left gratitude in return, repairs made to a fence, a patch sewn on a mat, a story recorded and then left in the dark, where no one else might read it. Our bonds deepened in small and dangerous ways. Vince and I grew less like cousins and more like kin by choice. The valley's denizens folded us into their days as if the act of acceptance were part of their courage. And yet the rotor came again, this time, closer. The machine's shadow crawled across the canopy like a slow footfall. The valley held its breath. Kura drew patterns in the air with his fingers, a language of deflection and counting. 3 stood at the mouth of the cave with a carved staff and a face that said he would not let them pass if he could help it. We watched as the machine moved, and for the first time we saw the pilot lower a rope ladder and drop a small crew into the trees. They moved like people who had rehearsed the terrain. Their steps were not clumsy. They'd brought nets and crates. One of them carried a cage, steel and cruel, like something that did not belong to the soft contours of the valley. They worked as if the exercise was purely technical, as if the moral calculus had already been settled on another hillside where men in faraway rooms argued for policy. Kura watched them for a long time and then, with sudden determination, set his hand to the ground. He tapped a rhythm into the earth with the flat of his palm and then, almost to himself, as a prayer, began to sing. The song built, slow as sap, until it coalesced into harmonies from voices we had not known they possessed. The air contracted, as if listening, and in the middle of my terror, I felt something tighten and then release. The machine that had dropped men into our valley turned and rose. It did not hover or engage. It left like a thing that had been given a response it had not been prepared for. We were saved that day by a song, or we were spared by conjecture and timing, and an operator who decided the cost wasn't worth the chase. The rational mind prefers the latter. In the valley, songs were weapons and memories and shields. In our world, they were often dismissed as quaint. That day, if nothing else, the valley's repertoire of defense had accomplished a small miracle. But the relief was brittle. The men on the hillside were not the same as the roaders. They would come again. Machines were tools of a persistent logic. The cave's images, the casings, the torn photographs, all suggested cycles of interest that would intensify, not peter out with whim. We had to make a decision of time and will. We could leave and try to find law and sympathy, which might bring protection, or might bring the very men who had once posed for pictures with an animal. Or we could stay and become guardians, a human presence woven into their daily life, with all the moral and practical consequences that entailed. We stayed. We chose, in the faint light of a valley that had learned how to keep secrets, to keep one more. We stayed because we believed that some things belonged to the dark, and because the alternative, the world's hungry curiosity, was worse than silence. The choice did not simplify anything. It complicated us. It made our lives longer in service and shorter in comfort. We learned new rhythms of watchfulness and new rituals of concealment. We cataloged, we taught, we loved in small, cautious ways. We also learned to accept the reality that the valley would have enemies as long as men saw it as a prize. I do not tell this story because I think the reader should believe every line as a truth. I tell it because for 5 years my life became a ledger of small mercies and sharper. I do not tell this story because I think the reader should believe every line as a truth. I tell it because for 5 years my life became a ledger of small mercies and sharper calculations, and because the choices we made in that valley altered more than the shape of our days. They shifted the axis of what Vince and I understood family to be. The first winter folded us close. Snow came early and the valley became a muffled, careful place, every sound softened by a white blanket. We learned how to burrow, how to bank the shelters with sod and spruce to keep drafts out, how to pack the rafters with dried grass so the weight of snow would pass by without crushing a home. 3 taught me to braid willow cords into a pattern that would stretch and take weather, and Kura showed me a way to lay stones that channeled meltwater away from the entrances. Those skills mattered less for their novelty than for the hours it bought us, time in which trust could thicken into habit. We counted that time in other ways too. Vince, ever the photographer, set up a makeshift darkroom in the Bronco's back, lining the windows with blankets so the red light could do its work. He learned to develop film by feel, how long to dunk when an image revealed itself on a sheet like a secret, and in doing so, he created, on strips of glossy paper, a proof that the valley had texture beyond legend. 3 loved the prints. He would sit and trace the silhouettes of his own hands in them, sometimes tilting a photograph so a beam of sun fell across it and made the silver shimmer like a river. In his drawings he began to include the 2 of us, 2 human figures, one with a camera, the other with a notebook, penned with an affection that read like permission. We kept our promise to the valley, document without dramatizing. I made lists and indexes, precise and boring, because detail is the language of proof. Measurements, print length, shelter aperture, the pitch and spacing of rafters, fleshed out a case that was not built for headlines but for memory. Vince cataloged the paper bundles in oilcloth, numbering each, listing dates and the peculiar runic marks we did not understand. Those bundles became our treasures and our burden. They were what we risked the most to keep. There were gifts too. Kura, in his slow way, taught me how to listen to a stump. If you pressed an ear to a solid piece of wood and waited, you could hear the beetle song and the slow migration of sap. He could tell by the taste of a leaf or the bend of a reed whether spring would come early. 3 introduced us to a way of salting meat that made it last through storms. He taught us to make dyes from a certain lichen that would hold under rain. Little inventions, and each one folded us into the valley's survival like a stitch. We learned their names as they taught us theirs. Not always with words. Their language was primarily in intonation and touch, in symbolic marks smoothed into bark. But names emerged. 3's name was not a number to them, but a shorthand. The third of many, perhaps, or a name of place. He laughed, if that is the right word, with a sharpness that always showed at the corners of his mouth. Kura's name felt like a verb, a weight, a center. something that steadied storms. He had survived a long list of absences. He pointed to certain images in the cave and made the absence gesture. Sometimes his eyes closed and he sang names that were not ours to utter, and we honored him by listening and by remembering. There were other intimacies we had to learn quickly. The valley's people could read the wind in a way we could not. Kura taught us to watch for the shadowing of cloud and how rotors moved through the scalps of trees differently than any thunderstorm. He trained us in a quiet protocol, signs in bark, the tilt of a stone, a shallow pit dug and recovered in a pattern only they would recognize. We installed early warning systems, as much ritual as engineering, strings knotted to bells, a line of rusted metal we could strike to send an odd note down the ridge. It was primitive and effective in its way, and it bought us time on more than one occasion. Those occasions grew more frequent. In the second year, the rotors came with an arrogance that suggested practice. They no longer skimmed the ridgelines like curious birds. They carved search patterns. Once, in late August, a pair of machines threaded each other's searchlight across the valley in overlapping circles, a metallic choreography that left the animals in the trees frantic and the river trembling. We hunkered with Kura and 3 in the largest shelter, breathing through their song as through a respirator, listening for the telltale hum of a winch. The machines did not land that day, but they left behind briefer evidence. Fresh notches cut into saplings at a specific height, strips of painted metal torn from a door frame, a faint smear on a stone that, when I smelled it with a gloved nose, suggested petroleum and a manufactured detergent. We began to see the pattern of attention. It was not random. Flights increased near the time of the valley's fruiting seasons. Ground teams appeared when the snow thawed and rivers rose, times when the valley's resources made the place visible. The cave drawings, the bundles, the corroded tin can with its brittle notices, all of it began to read less like inevitability and more like a targeted campaign. Someone out there had cataloged this place, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, its useful seasons. Then came the thing that shifted everything from theoretical to immediate, the first real attempt to take. It was a spring thaw year where the melt came in fits and starts. The ground was a patchwork of mud and ice. The river had widened and softened the banks. We had been underground at the cave, making measurements and adding a new panel of charcoal to a wall where fleshier memories would find their place. 3 had drawn a line of figures carrying baskets. Kura had hummed in a minor key, and then said the name of a place that sounded like a crossroads. We noticed the absence first. A scent, unmistakable, of rubber and machine oil threaded the air. Then tracks. Boots. Not the deep, practiced stagger of hunters who had learned the terrain. They were new, heavy, made by newcomers who did not mind noise. Vince saw them first, tracing the outline with his hand, and then frowning as he compared them to the older, smaller prints that threaded the valley. The new ones were lined with a tread pattern none of us recognized. They showed a heel and a toe, and the prints sat at a pace that suggested a march, not a hunt. We moved, with a quiet urgency, to see what we could find. A net, crude but newly affixed, lay across a narrow defile they had misread as a trail. Rope hung in loops from branches like sleeping snakes. A small crate, stamped with a word that could have been specimen or special, sat half-buried on the far side of a bank. There were also more subtle things, the faint indentation of a drogue on soft soil, as if someone had tested a small parachute. A broken dart caught in the bark of a fir, its tip dulled and stained with some chemical that sent my skin prickling. We had traces. We had time. We had fear. The plan they executed was not unthinkable. It was efficient. At dawn, the rotors came low and noiseless, finding a pocket of fog to hide in. Men dropped from small chutes into the tree line and moved with the strange grace of those trained to be unseen. One managed to get a line across the clearing, and a net was hoisted to span a path they expected would funnel movement, an ugly mechanical trap in a place where the community had learned to move like shadow. We were there when the first shout went up. It was not human. It was the sound Kura made when he realized they had been betrayed by the quiet. The valley erupted into organized chaos. Shelters were emptied, children spirited away into hollow roots, 3 rushing to places I had never seen him move, swift and silent. Kura sang a sequence of low notes so sharp they felt like a strike in the chest. We acted by instinct. Vince, with his camera slung, grabbed a pack of film and a roll of hemp cord. I grabbed the field journal and the small flint kit we had obtained from an old trunk. What happened next was a tangle of things I can only describe as memory and inference, because when adrenaline runs hot, the edges of a day blur into motion. A man with a tranquilizer gun stepped from behind a tree and fired at a target I did not yet see. A creature, not a human, fell, limp, a movement that lodged like ice in my throat. 3 screamed in a way that was more than sound. It was a grief that broke the pattern of our restraint. Kura moved like an animal possessed of human purpose, and bore down on the man with a single, impossibly fast motion that knocked both the gun and the man aside. The sound that followed was nothing like the shootouts men had in films. It was a series of hand-to-hand clashes and the desperate scrambling of nets. I will not describe the injuries in detail. The archive of that morning is a ledger of fright and narrow escapes rather than gore, and it is important that the reader not imagine the valley as a battlefield of bodies. There was harm, yes. There was a child hidden under a root mat who would not speak for days after. There were tools stolen and a small chest we had catalogued, full of jars that had held pressed herbs, carried off. There were, tragically, artifacts taken that could not be replaced. A bark portrait of a matriarch and a carved staff scored with family marks. Those losses were grievous to Kura in a way I have no simple words for. He pressed his hands to the ground and sang a dirge that left us all raw. But the thing that changed the day's measure was not what they took or what they left. It was what they had tried to do, what that crystalline plan implied. They had come prepared to harvest people. They had ropes, nets, drugs. They had machines for lifting and crates for shipping. That gear did not hint at simple curiosity. It hinted at an intent to remove and possess, to convert life into currency or specimen. It was the embodiment of the terrifying secret the cave had warned us about. After that morning, the valley's rhythm altered in a way that settled into bone. Kura and 3 led a cleansing ritual. Smoke, songs, the slow backing of charcoal over those panels in the cave where pain had been fresh. They set new talismans along the perimeter, marks that spelt out warnings to any like them and carried stories to the next valley with the same symbols. We replaced what we could and hid what we could not. We burned photographs that could be used against us if they fell into unscrupulous hands. We buried negatives in a metal can, wrapped in oilcloth, then hid that can in a hollow root with a false bottom. We began to build caches beyond the valley, small and deceptive, where maps and names and real-world references were deliberately absent. We also learned another thing that winter. We could not fight the world by brute force. We could at best be cunning and patient. Vince, who had once been more of a soldier than a lover of secrecy, turned into a conspirator of survival. He taught some of the valley how to mimic human tracks, how to lay a false trail into the high country, while the real community shifted along side streams and through badger runs. I taught weekly an old trick my grandfather had used to hide meat. Bury it under a layer of fragrant moss and then put a ring of sharp weeds around it. These were small strategies, neither noble nor heroic, but they saved a cache of seeds and a carved staff that would otherwise have been lost. The months that followed were a slow test of endurance. We learned to read aerial patterns like weather reports, certain days of the week, certain bank holidays, certain phases of the moon when radio chatter in the cities rose and the rotors followed. We listened to the AM radio in the Bronco and pinned our schedules against broadcasts from distant towns, car auctions and farm reports, anything that might clue us into when the machines were less likely to be in the sky. It was a strange kind of intelligence work built on the humblest of tools. The valley paid a cost. Some families withdrew into deeper hollows and chose a life of smaller circles. Others left, trailing into the high country with only the clothes on their backs, seeking places that were less visible but did not have the deep communal memory of the caverns. Kura bore his losses without spectacle, but grief was a tide he did not try to hide. Sometimes he would wake in the night and walk the clearing, pressing his hand to the bark portraits as if to ensure no one else would mistake the faces there for something other than kin. We too bore the cost. Vince began to sleep with one eye open. Nightmares visited him, scenes from the war that replayed with the rotors overlaying the helicopters of his past. He would wake and stand at the Bronco's open door, cigarette in hand though he had sworn off years before, and stare at the sky until the gray lost its patience and the dawn came. He started to carry a small pistol in a leather holster he had fashioned from an old jacket. When I frowned, he would look at me and say, "It's not for killing, it's for scaring." It is difficult to reconcile the man who fixed film negatives with the man who carried a pistol at night, but that is the way of people folded by persistent danger. There were other fractures. We argued the ethics of exposure over and over across the years. Once in the second winter, Vince nearly walked out. He could not reconcile keeping a secret about a culture with his private sense of duty to truth. "We could go to someone who would protect them," he said hotly one night, slapping his palm against the Bronco's hood. "We could go to a university, a scientist who—" I stopped him. We had rehearsed that argument like a scene from two men who had read too many books and not enough futures. He wanted to make the valley a cause. I wanted to make it a haven. We both loved the idea of saving. We diverged on who could be trusted to do it. In the third year, our fears took a new shape. We found a crate half mired at a river bend, its paint flaked and a logo half peeling off. The letters were generic, an acronym the size of a hand, and beneath them a smudged designation, Field Ops. Inside, beneath a layer of dusty blankets, lay a ledger book filled with shorthand and lists. It was the kind of crude administration you see in any department that wants to pretend secrecy as a virtue. Lists of coordinates, which we would not, and must not, record, dates of overflies, and chillingly, a reference to interest in ectobotanical properties, and to therapeutic potential, in ways that sounded clinical and yet predatory. There were also plastic cards with numbers, and a notation that read like an instruction to pay field agents on a performance basis. I am careful how I write that down because the document could not tell me much more than a suspicion. It was, to my eye, a contractor's ledger, private actors who sell services for a price. It suggested that what came against the valley was not a single mind but a market, men and firms who could be hired to find, capture, and deliver what the client desired. Whatever the motivations, profit, curiosity, a desire to weaponize the unique, there was clearly an organized chain of interest. That was the terrifying secret made mundane. An industry existed for converting otherness into product. When we found the ledger, 3 sat with his forehead resting on the edge of a crate and made the scraping gesture of absence we had come to know too well. He took a narrow strop and carved into the inner lid a new mark, 3 intersecting arcs that became a cipher for us. Avoidance. He wrapped the ledger in oilcloth, and together we sank it in a stone-lined pit behind a waterfall where the sound would mask any excavation. It was as symbolic an act as any, but symbols held the valley together like a net. Years accumulated more than calendars, a stack of small rescues, a handful of thefts, a carved staff recovered from under a collapsed log, a set of film negatives burned by accident and replaced in careful ceremony. We grieved and we repaired. We buried what we could not take and taught our friends how to speak to strangers with a flat, uninterested voice. We made the valley less vulnerable by teaching it how not to be noticed. Then, in our 5th spring, something happened that finally made the decision we had hovered around unavoidable. The machines came in a different shape, not merely as a predator dropping men into trees, but as an operation that intended to root and hold. It began as an ordinary hum over the ridge. We were tending a cache when the rotor sigh rolled across the clearing like a benediction turned threat. This time, there were 3 machines. They flew in a triangle and kept their pattern like it had been rehearsed on a grid. Below one, a bellied crate lodged with a stenciled symbol that bore a resemblance to the logo on the ledger. Men moved with nets and with a cage designed in a way that suggested shipping as part of its function. Padded inside, cathol for air exchange, a lock built with a mechanical cruelty. We watched them lower a platform near the river's mouth and park it in a place that lured the valley's prey into an exposed strip. The plan was immediate and terrifying in its clarity. Drive from the ridgeline and corral toward the platform, force a movement that would make capture efficient. They had the equipment for sedation, for containment, for transit. They had the kind of thinking that turned living beings into units on a manifest. Kura saw it too. His voice that morning was not grief but a weapon, clear, bright, and unbending. He gathered the community in a place where the creek split into 2 and drew a map in the mud with his finger. He tapped our hands, then his own chest, then the notch on a staff that marked where the children had been hidden in past raids. He did not speak the language we knew, but the meaning was not lost on us. The valley would not be captured while they could move. We formulated a plan that tried, as all our plans had, to honor life. We could allow some bait, some false move, and lead the machines to an empty pocket where they would find nothing but rocks. Or, we could create a diversion that would force the men to land, and then, if we were lucky, we might disable their equipment. We argued quickly and urgently. Vince, who had known more about the mechanics, said we could sabotage the winch cable, cut it clean and make the machine concrete-bound. I hated the idea of damaging property when that property was a machine, and the people inside it might be men who had their own families, but I hated more the thought of steel cages and sedated bodies. The choice we faced was not merely tactical, it was moral. To act would be to risk escalation, perhaps death, perhaps forced retaliation that would make every valley visible. To not act might mean the end of a lineage captured for a crate in a city market. We had both the moral urgency of parents and the historian's fear of annihilation. In the end, the decision was in the shape of Kura's hand on my shoulder and the way Three's eyes were hard as flint. We chose to act in a way that would minimize harm and maximize the chance of escape. The diversion was simple in its cruelty to logistics. A controlled noise, the release of smoke and sound to distract two of the machines, while Kura and a small contingent moved the communal children and elders through a submerged route path to a known hollow across the river. At the same time, Vince and I would make ourselves visible in a place that would draw one crew away from the hide, while a false trail would mislead the other. The plan was dangerous and imperfect, and it relied on timing that would be measured not in watches, but in breath. It unfolded with the kind of awful precision that life sometimes demands. The smoke rose and rolled, and the men landed, blinking in the sudden obscuration, then split. Two machines circled the smoke, and the men disembarked, nets at the ready. The third, which had been set up for a direct intercept, hovered over our chosen clearing. I will not romanticize what came next. We did what we could to prevent the capture. Kura sang until his voice was a raw instrument. Three threw himself into the interstices of the men, slamming and pulling with a force I had not expected. Vince, who had always carried a grin and a camera, moved like a man who needed to be useful, and struck a man with a blunt object until the man went down, then dragged a crate into a stand of brush to block the route. I ran, and I yelled, and I recorded, because even in the immediate moment the habit of proof stayed with me. I filmed nets being hoisted and men scrambling and a particular emblem stenciled on a crate with a lettered word that could have been field, and then again, OPS. We saved some. We lost some. The men managed to seize a young adult in the confusion, a figure I had seen in Three's gallery not a month before. He was hoisted up and slipped into a cage that clanked with the finality of a closing book. The machine rose and left with a howl that shrieked across the valley. 2 rotors and a promise of return. Kura's howl that afternoon was not a sound as much as a hollowing. He sat with his head in his hands and beat the earth with flat palms until the soil reddened in thumbprints. He drew a circle in the dirt and scratched a pattern that would be a memorial. 3 pressed his face to a scrap of bark and began to carve a new panel for the cave, hands moving with a speed and precision born of loss. We were wasted and furious, and above all, changed. That night, in the dim light, we made a choice that would define the rest of those 5 years and the years after. We would no longer be keepers of a single secret. We would be searchers. The logic was simple and terrible. The valley was not the only place like it. If men could build an operation that trafficked in living things, then there were likely other pockets, other communities that had also been cataloged, attacked, and scattered. The ledger in the crate, the stencil on the platform, the men with mechanical cages, all suggested that this was not an isolated failing of ethics, but a practiced industry. If that was true, then the valley's survival required not merely secrecy, but the reconstruction of a network, hidden caches, safe routes, signals that could trace the movement of such operations and warn other communities. It was a plan that would cost us more. It would mean leaving the valley at times, crossing ridges and rivers, and seeking places that had the same kinds of stories carved into bark. It would mean pretending to be hunters, vagabonds, or men of the road while we listened for signs in the way a father listens for the rasp of breath. It would mean violence of a kind we were not proud of, lying, subterfuge, tampering with machines. Each small transgression sat on us like a scale, and we balanced them against what we had watched the roaders do. Vince and I trained for those journeys. We learned how to travel light and to throw our scent off a trail. We wrapped the Bronco's identity in a dozen layers of confusion. False plates washed and reaffixed with grease, the radio tuned to empty bands, film's negatives buried under rocks. We became ghosts who could build a bridge in an hour and leave no trace in the morning. We cached emergency film and money in places with no maps. The search took us into places I had only seen in Three's drawings. Valleys with different languages, plateaus where roofs were made of packed clay rather than bark, villages that had signs of being emptied years before. We found traces. A child's carving in the shape of a rotored machine on a fence, a line of ash where a shelter had once burned, an old tin can with a torn and faded notice offering a reward. We found survivors, families who had been pushed into the high country and had built lives on sheer stubbornness. We found fear, too, the kind of terror that made people cage themselves and never tell a neighbor of an uninvited humming in the sky. Each meeting was its own moral test. We had to decide who could handle contact, who must be warned to move, and who we should bring into the faint network of safe houses we were building. Sometimes we succeeded. A community on the north side of a river learned our signs and began to braid their rafters with a notch only we had taught. Sometimes we failed and left a trail that would be hunted. The ledger of human error grew. Our mission changed our relationships with the valley. Kura's eyes grew older, but there was a steadiness to them I had come to trust more than any other compass. He would look at us and say, in the language we had developed, that the work was not only to hide but to gather. Three, with his relentless art, began a project of drawing other communities as we located them. A map, not in roads, but in faces and in hands. Vince wrote his own manifest in photographs and in a book that would sit, sealed in the cave, meant for no eyes beyond the valley unless some future called for witness. Time did not make the danger gentler. It made it more efficient. There were better nets and more cunning flight patterns. There were contractors who had learned how to thread the legal with the illegal, forms to sign, front companies, men who knew how to make a crate appear as a harmless research parcel. Each time, we adapted. Each time, the valley tightened its circle, and still there were moments of tenderness severe enough to sustain us. I remember a spring when Three brought me a roll of film he had hidden under his mat and had exposed in a way that made the pictures ghost-like. A child running between poles, leaves blown like money. Kura's profile as he sang into the dawn. Vince, hair too long, laughing with a boarded-up grin. We hung those prints in the largest shelter where the light hit them and made them look like small altars. We would sit and trace them with our fingers and remember why secrecy had been chosen. We came to understand, slowly, that what we were defending was not only lives but a different way of being with the world. A stance that did not convert every oddity into capital, that did not reduce otherness to data. The Valley's way was not primitive. It was deliberately different. It valued memory over extraction, lineage over novelty. That ethic was why men wanted it. They saw value in difference divorced from personhood. After 5 years, there was another moment of reckoning. It came not with a roar of rotors, but with a stranger at our edge. A woman who had once lived in a town a day's ride away, and who had found her way into the high country with a camera and a pocket knife and a theory. She was not a hunter in the crude sense. She called herself a journalist and said the right things about preservation and stewardship. She carried a certificate from a university she named, and letters tucked into a folder. She spoke of policies and law and knew the words that made bureaucrats listen. We took her in, cautiously. She told a story that could seduce anyone with a sense for public goods, protection via disclosure. She promised confidentiality and that she would lobby for a protected status for the valley if we provided documentation. She asked to meet the elders. I remember Kura watching from the doorway, his hands folded in a way that made the woman's credentials look thin. Her presence forced the argument into daylight again. We sat, as men and creatures and a woman with paper, and hashed the impossible options. She showed us studies, cold and detailed, that suggested protection through visibility was possible. Vince, who had once wanted the truth from the mountaintops, felt a tug like tides in him. I watched Cora's face as she talked. He did not speak in words, but he tapped his chest and then moved to the cave and returned with a new panel he had carved. A machine, a net, and a child's drawings, overlaid with the faces of those who had been taken. He set it down like evidence. In the end, we made a choice shaped by experience and fear and love. We told her some truths. That we could not allow the valley to be public, that those who sought to exploit would follow the light like moths. We offered instead an alternative. If she wished to help, she could be a conduit who worked quietly to protect, who could sometimes publish phrased pieces about the ethics of conservation without ever naming a place. She agreed, perhaps out of idealism, perhaps out of a hunger, and we let her go with a set of photographs lacking exact locations and a firm charge to guard them. We also gave her something we could not unwrite, the knowledge that the valley existed and that the roaders would come. It was a risk, but by that time risk was a constant pen in our hands. As the 5th year crested and ebbed, our ledger held both small victories and unspeakable losses. The valley's gallery expanded with new panels, some painted with victories, roaders chased away by a song, some carved with names of those who had been taken. Three's art became increasingly political in its way. He drew the men with the cages as faceless machines, their faces replaced by photographers' shutters and dollar signs. Cora planted a row of stones beside the river and set a staff at the center with a carved hand, a symbol of warning and of touch. We also began the slow work that would become our long-term strategy, a search for others and a network of warnings. We taught certain elders and a handful of younger scouts the cipher marks 3 had devised. We hid caches of drugs and food in places where roads converged, but where the chance of a machine's landing was low. We found sympathetic eyes in neighboring valleys, an old trapper who knew how to muffle the sound of a sled, a woman with a horse who would carry a sealed message across a ridge for a price. We stitched a web of favors and debts, and in the making of it we became less like a secret and more like a small, determined resistance. The valley was no longer just a place to protect. It was a center of operations, a pulsing node that might hint others toward safety. That mission made us bolder and more careful in equal measure. It demanded we take risks we had previously avoided, and gave us a purpose that turned grief into a direction. Now, years after that 5th season, the year the man in the cage was carried off into the grid, we still move in the dark. I live with a ledger of names and a series of images wrapped in oilcloth that I take out seldom. Vince's hair is gray at the temples and his smile comes in rarer flashes. He is still a photographer, though his work now is often stolen hours, an image of a child's hands, a charcoal panel, the texture of a staff. Cora's voice has retained its depth, though his step has slowed. 3 draws from a place of furious love that sometimes makes me weep. The valley is smaller now in a way and larger in another. Its treasures still hide in bark and in the wet places beside the river. The cave gallery grows. It is now both a history and a shrine and a warning. Visitors come sometimes in the way of wind, stray hunters who pass through and leave a mark, then move on. We respond with the same mix of tact and iron that has made us who we are. And the terrifying secret remains, an organized interest in what they saw as usable. Machines have not stopped flying. Men still write ledger notes and private firms still exist whose language translates life into product. The details change, the names, the acronyms, but the pattern is persistent. That knowledge altered everything. It turned us from accidental visitors into defenders, and ultimately into seekers for other hidden worlds. We have found some of them. In the north, in a basin where the sun sits low and the willows bow like old people, we found a pair of survivors who had learned to live beneath the ice. In a rocky hollow to the east, we discovered a small group who had resisted capture by bartering with passing fur traders and by making themselves unremarkable. Each discovery was a victory because it meant another lineage had not been reduced to a mounted curiosity in a distant lab. Each also reminded us how many more places remained vulnerable, and how very mobile the appetite for otherness had become. Our search is, at this point, less romantic than it sounds. It is not an adventure with jaunty music. It is instead a ledger and a list and a set of rituals designed to keep more faces on walls and hands in the world. We leave markers for those who know what to look for. A certain notch in a post, a specific arrangement of stones that suggests shelter is legal but empty, a smear of soot in a particular pattern that tells others a route is safe. We use the language of the valley to spread protection without ever naming the place. I do not write this as a boast. The work is not heroic in any simple sense. It is small and hard and sometimes cruel, because to protect one place we sometimes have to let another go, and the calculus is a blade that never dulls. We are, in the end, imperfect stewards. We have failed as much as we have succeeded. We have watched men in cages and we have watched children laugh in the river. The tension between those images is a constant lodestone. The last time the rotors came low enough to make the river wobble, we were ready in a way we had not been 5 years earlier. The machines took a route we had not expected, and, in their assumption, left vulnerabilities we could exploit, not with violence, but with a patient misdirection. They left knowing they had not won, but that their reach was real. And that is the truth I want to leave in the record. Power is not only in the machines, it is in the systems that make capture easy. Our only hope against such systems is a stubborn, human stubbornness. Families protecting families, strangers building networks of respite, songs that can disguise the hum of a rotor enough for a child to slip into a hollow. When I think back on those 5 years, I think of small things. The smell of resin on Kura's hands. The way Three's thumb would smear charcoal across his jaw when he was deep in thought. Vince's laughter at a joke that had nothing to do with humor, but everything to do with relief. I think of nights when the rotors came and we all held our breath and invented songs that I now know by heart. I think of the ledger we buried, and of the pictures we burned, and of the promises we made to one another with a gravity that felt ancient. We are still searching. We will always be searching, because the appetite that carved that ledger does not rest. Our mission has become a life. We train new pairs of ears to hear the rotors early. We teach young hands how to carve a safe mark. We bury caches where names can be hidden in the bark of a tree. We are, in our imperfect way, trying to make a difference. And I will say this plainly. What I saw in the valley changed me. The creatures who are not quite human and not quite anything I had a name for taught me how to be tender in ways I had not known. They taught me how to keep a secret when a secret means life. They taught me that protection sometimes requires isolation, and that disclosure often serves those who would take. They taught me that love can cross the boundaries we so lovingly keep inventing. I end where I began, with the prints in the mud and the music of a valley that insisted on keeping its own. We were there for 5 years, and the terrifying secret we uncovered, the existence of an organized industry of hunting and capture, changed everything. It shifted our terms. It made us guardians and searchers. It made us compilers of stories and protectors of strangers who became family. If this story moved you, share it with someone who values wonder and the quiet duty of protection.